everyone. We have one more session before lunch, so if you could please take your seats. It's going to be a bit of a rapid fire one. All right, fantastic. So many good questions already this morning, and a few that I hope this session can go into further detail on, specifically around trust responsibility, around how we allocate money to schools, and really what that looks like on the ground. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our three speakers here. So we have Bridget Hill. Sorry.
It kind of blends together.
Yeah, anyways, Bridget Hill, the Wyoming Attorney General, Kurt Meier, the Wyoming State Treasurer, and Brian Farmer, the Executive Director of the Wyoming School Boards Association. So, thank you.
I think I got it. All right, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I'm pleased to be here, in part because of my great love of state lands. I've been associated with state lands, I always say, since I was a baby attorney. And Pat Crank, the Attorney General at the time that I began in the Attorney General's office, assigned me to represent them and the Board of Land Commissioners. And I've appreciated state lands ever since then. And the mission of state lands and the goals that they're trying to achieve when you become associated with them, I tell people, gets in your soul. And it really did for me. And so I appreciate everything that Jason had to say before us. He really did a great job with the history of state trust lands and the mission of state trust lands. And you can tell he feels it in his soul, kind of the same that I do. So I was so pleased to be able to come and talk about that. Jason stole all the good stuff, though, in his presentation. And so they asked me to come and talk more about fiduciary responsibilities, fiduciary duties and trust responsibilities, which I was also happy to do. And Marguerite asked a question that would lead to this anyway. And so I'm glad to be here and talk about that just briefly. When I think about fiduciary duties, my mind goes immediately to law school and business law class right across the street here with Harvey Gelb. And he had us read what is known as one of the first cases to really kind of shape the law about fiduciary duties. And it was a case called, and I might mispronounce the names, but he's not here to correct me, so we'll go with it. Meinhard versus Salmon. And it was written by Justice Cardoza, who becomes a justice of the United States Supreme Court and was known for his kind of flowery writing and kind of his prose-like writing in his opinions. At the time he decides this case, though, he's on the New York Court of Appeals. And what this case generally pertains to, I'll be quick with the facts, is you had a man named Salmon, Walter Salmon. And Walter Salmon was a real estate developer in New York. And his goal was generally to get long-term leases, improve the property, and then make money that way. So he gets a long-term lease from some property owners of the Bristol Hotel, which was a big deal in New York at that time. And that's a really great thing for him, except he's short on cash. He doesn't have a lot of cash on hand. And so lucky for him, he comes across Meinhard, and he's got cash on hand. He's in the finance business, and they strike up a partnership to improve the Bristol Hotel and make money for the both of them. And as partnerships sometimes do, things went a little south. Things got a little bit rocky, and they began to squabble. By the end of that long-term lease, that 20-year lease, the two could barely stand each other. They barely talk to each other. They barely work together. And so it comes time to renew the lease, and Salmon basically cuts Meinhardt out. He engages in some self-dealing, for lack of a better term. And so Meinhardt sues him. It ends up in front of the New York Court of Appeals, and Meinhardt wins. It's fairly run-of-the-mill case when you think about how partnership law now and how those things sometimes go south. But it's important because this ends up being for how Cardozo describes fiduciary duties. And this ends up being one of the most cited business law cases in the nation. And even today, what he says about fiduciary duties has helped shape the law and is relevant today. So I got this down so I could say it exactly because I didn't want to mess this up. But it made an impression on me, and I do continue to think about it whenever somebody mentions fiduciary responsibilities. And this is how he described it. He said, the fiduciary duty is something stricter than the morals of the marketplace, not honesty alone, but the punctilio of an honor most sensitive. It is the standard of behavior. Indeed, fiduciaries owe to one another the duty of the finest loyalty. Now that describes it pretty well. I think maybe it made an impression because I had no idea what a punctilio was, right? So I had to go look that up when he talks about what but the punctilio of an honor most sensitive. And it turns out that's careful observance of a code. And so that's the first time you hear in the law fiduciary duties described as that, and a duty of honesty and loyalty most high. You'll see over time a lot of law describes it the same way, and you will see that the Wyoming Supreme Court, while they didn't write it quite as flowery as Justice Cardozo does, they say it similarly. Here's how they would explain it. They say that a fiduciary duty is, of course, the duty to manage trust property responsibly for the benefit of another. And they say your duty is a duty of loyalty and care. It's to act with the care that a person in a like position would reasonably exercise under similar circumstances and in a manner they reasonably believe to be in the best interests of the beneficiary. Now, why is that important here today? Well, Jason gave us a tip because he said it a whole bunch. The land that was granted to the state when we became a state for various trust purposes are held in trust, as are the funds that are generated from that money. And so the trustees, the Board of Land Commissioners, or the State Loan and Investment Board, depending on if you're talking about the land assets or if you're talking about the money assets and the permanent funds that we manage to make money for the beneficiaries, they have those obligations. They have fiduciary responsibilities with respect to those lands and those funds. And those responsibilities are a great duty, the highest duty that you can have in the law to another are the fiduciary duties. When we talk about trust responsibilities in particular, you could probably break down trust responsibilities into three responsibilities primarily. And I know the treasurer as a member of these two boards, but also the treasurer himself, looking after other permanent funds, not just the common school funds, takes these responsibilities seriously. The first one would be the duty of loyalty and care. So the duty of loyalty and care could better be described as one which is, when you think about loyalty, it's as the term you would think as it pertains in the way you talk about it in normal life. The duty of loyalty means that the trustee must always act in the best interests of the beneficiaries and must not put his or her own interest above the beneficiaries where trust matters are involved. The duty of good faith that goes along with that means that the trustee must exercise reasonable care, skill, and caution in administering the trust. So that's the first one, the duty of good faith and loyalty. The second one would be the duty of reasonable skill and diligence. The trustee has the duty to act reasonably and competently in all matters of trust administration. And in practice, the trustee needs to invest property in a diversified manner, make unbiased decisions, and keep trust property separate from other property. And that goes to your question there, Mr. Swartz, if I recall correctly, about how do we make sure we're keeping that property where it goes and the funds where they go. And the treasurer could answer that a little better than me, but we're very careful about that. That is a trust responsibility. We have each parcel of land coded for what trust it goes to, who the beneficiary is, and they account for that very carefully and make sure that goes to the treasurer's office appropriately. And then the third duty would be the duty to give personal attention, and I kind of like this one. The trustee is held to a high standard of care and may be expected to pay more attention to the trust's investments and assets than he would his own. And I like that they say that one because I'm going to confess to you all, I'm not necessarily completely responsible in my own dealings, but as not completely responsible with my own assets. But if you are a trustee and you have a fiduciary duty, I like that they say it this way, that you need to pay better attention and better care than you might in your own affairs. And so those fundamentally are what the fiduciary duties are and what trust responsibility are. And those follow, that's not just in the world we think out there unrelated to government, but those follow both the trust land themselves and the funds. And I would say this, just to bring it home in terms of state trust land itself and my experiences as the state trust land director, I would find that there was never really an instance that you think about when these cases get to court of partners squabbling or self-dealing or somebody trying to cut others out. Where I think you see the tension or maybe the friction related to these trust responsibilities and these fiduciary duties was more in the nature of two noble causes, which I think is some of what we're here to talk about today. And when I think about two noble causes, what I mean is a desire to see the state as a whole succeed and the people as a whole succeed and accommodate multiple uses when you still have a fiduciary duty to the school beneficiaries. So some examples that I thought about, and one that's obviously already been mentioned here today, is what do you do with sportsmen and recreationalists who want to use that land but are not necessarily a paying user? Can you accommodate those uses to further the benefits of our state, further some noble missions of the state without impacting the beneficiaries? And I think the board struck a pretty good balance related to there. I heard Governor Meade say it this way one time, and it struck a chord in me, which is we want our core industries and our people to succeed and to be happy, but never at the expense of our beneficiaries. So there is a balance to be had there. Can you allow for those uses and not harm your beneficiaries? And I think the board strikes a balance that way. The other one, Jason kind of hit on that I think a lot about too, where you get this tension, would be with local governments. For instance, they get landlocked. They need to annex some land outside or buy some property outside what is their current boundary. The one I think about is up in Lincoln County, the dump. I'm looking at Ben. We had some folks They were looking to put their city dump on a parcel of state land, but they wanted that state land for free to be able to do that. Well, is that a use a trustee can allow and still live up to their fiduciary responsibilities or their obligations to the beneficiaries? The same with even state governments. Maybe the military department needs a piece of state land and it ends up being a piece of common school trust land. Well, how can you accommodate that use? Again, two noble causes you're trying to accommodate, but some of those lands and some of those assets come with this high duty of responsibility under the law. And I think, again, both boards have worked really hard at that. I think the legislature understands that and has worked really hard on it. And then the final one would be seeing our industries succeed, building a really strong agricultural industry, making sure that that's an industry that can be maintained in the state, because they come to rely on state trust lands and federal lands as well in their operations, but never at the expense of the beneficiaries. Same with oil and gas. The royalty rate that the board has chosen to set, is that one that encourages the industry and makes our industry strong, because that's where we get most of our revenue, but never again at the expense of the beneficiaries. And so that's how I think those typical trust duties, trust responsibilities and fiduciary duties fit in with a government trust, a statutory trust. And I will pass it on to the next person, because I think we're going to take questions at the very end. Is that correct? Treasurer Meier.
Thank you. I guess when I look at a brief thing on a fiduciary, I think it goes clear back to the Crusades when the Lord left to go fight, and he left the land in the care of a steward. And in that situation, everything that the Attorney General said, that was the basis, I think, for the fiduciaries as we understand it. I think what we're getting into here is something called stakeholder fiduciaries. And the whole concept is being blurred by different stakeholders who aren't the beneficiaries as to how the land is going to be managed. Strictly speaking, it has to be managed for the beneficiaries. Now, you can take into consideration other stakeholders that might benefit as well. The oil industry, other industries that you can bring in there. Solar panels, if you look at that, you can get $800 an acre to put on solar panels. That same section of land might return $1,500 or $1,600 for an agricultural purpose. And so what do we do when we're faced with those type of things? To me, the difference really kind of plays into that. If you're going to get another $490,000, $495,000 more for a section of land, you have to make that decision for the beneficiary. But when you're doing it, I think one thing that has been lost in the whole situation is the communication with the local governments, the communications with the industries, and the communications about how that does affect the whole. And we'll take a case in point going into one of the most controversial areas of the state on state land, and that's Teton County. And so I had an opportunity to talk to both the Chamber of Commerce and some of the folks from the City Council this year during the legislative process. And I said, we have to get together and find out what your guys' plans are for the future of your community, at the same time trying to figure out how to maximize our state lands. And we can do that. There's some sections up there that if we have a 30-year plan, 40-year plan, that we can look at, where the utilities are, where that infrastructure is, where that infrastructure has to go, if that land is going to be used for the highest and best use. And that's really the grab right there. It has to be the highest and best use of the land. If we can't do that, and the situation that we have is on the Dunlap Ranch. We bought that a few years ago, put it into our inventory. we walked away from the highest and best use the other day during the slip board because that was a compromise with the local individuals that were there that were really up in arms about not in my backyard. And so what do we do when not in my backyard interferes with the highest and best use and the standard of duty that we have to represent the beneficiaries? From my perspective, we first have to look at it and get that conversation. Therein, I think we have to change some of the things that the state board has the ability to do, and that's a little bit, let's have those discussions before it comes to the state board to make the decision with the affected parties. And so that means we have to increase our communication. We have to change the structure in which we put these things forward so we actually have the best use in mind and the best plan. The other one is another controversial one, and that's the gravel pits around Natrona County. The state land board, nor any other division necessarily in government, has the ability to produce gravel in an environmental way that would not impact the current users. Now, there's a way to do that, but there's no structure in government that can actually come in and slow the process down and actually get a gravel engineering mining plan together that takes into effect the water. And there's disconnects and there's silos that nobody talks to each other. State engineer necessarily is limited on what they can do. The other areas of government and the state land board is limited on what we can do. We never can get the best outcome put forth for the beneficiaries and the other stakeholders. Stakeholders are secondary, my perspective. The beneficiaries are the beneficiaries. But there's no reason why we shouldn't enter these discussions a lot earlier and come up with plans that will actually be functional and still develop our natural resources. I think that can happen, but it's going to take a little difference in the emphasis about how we do our business. You look at sales of land and you look at leases of lands. We're still dealing with the 1890s to 1910, solutions as far as how auctions are preferred, how sales are looked at. I swear, if I would have put a front page ad or a fold out ad in the Wall Street Journal on the Cali parcel for $1 billion and say that you can't build anything more than a 20,000 square foot structure on this land, there's 50 billionaires out there that probably would have had $1 billion or would have came forward. We can't do anything like that. We can't actually employ real estate agents to actually go out and do things. And then we have an appraisal system that sometimes, I would say over the course of my last few years, is how do I want to say that? I don't want to say that appraisers aren't doing exactly what they should do the way they should do it. They go through the process, but a lot of times the appraisal number, I believe, is predetermined to make the deal go through smoothly. And that is frustrating because you see that, but we don't get the look at the underbelly, and the slip board doesn't get to discuss the underbelly of these different deals before it lays on our desk and we have to vote on it. And we get the information, I guess, kind of spoon-fed to us a few days before, and this is the desired outcome that's supposed to happen. So it's frustrating to me that it doesn't work right. But getting that communication, I think, is key to understand that we can get a better outcome for the beneficiaries. So we got to change our structure a little bit, and we need to move in that area. One thing that we are doing, that the way I looked at the Cali parcel, I was hoping we'd get $100 million. We could invest it because in 30 years, I'd have $1.744 billion. And to me, that would have been the highest and best use. Now, at the same time, you don't want to forget about the things the duties that we have to our industries and state lands and the functionality, especially in Converse County and in Campbell County with the production of our oil reserves up there. Because there's a big problem that we have with the federal government locking up certain parcels that won't let you drill a 3-mile lateral. And so there's a lot of communications that we have to have with this administration to make sure those things are locked up. I mean, not locked up, unlocked, and we can actually do that necessarily without not having to buy that land. I think it can happen. I really do. I think we've got the people in here that can talk to the president and talk to the people that he's appointed, and we're going to get those things going. But a lot of it, and I'm going to pass it. I've got a lot of other things I'd like to look at and talk about. But I say the biggest thing is that change our archaic ways of doing business, get us into this millennium, and really look at the communication that we have with all the stakeholders that are affected, but understanding that we work as a fiduciary for the beneficiaries. Thank you.
Well, after you heard from Jason this morning, and then General Hill, and now Treasurer Meier, all of the truly brilliant things are said, so you're left now with some thoughts from Brian Farmer. And I just want to share a little bit of perspective from the beneficiary, the people that benefit from these trust lands. You've heard that over 80% of those lands really are for the benefit of schools, for our Wyoming public school children. And to understand that benefit for school children, I think it's important to go back and understand a little bit of the history of our state. And so you can go back to our territorial period and recognize that Wyoming is a creature of creation in the post-Civil War era. So here we are in the 1860s now, and you have a guy by the name of John Campbell sent to Wyoming to become our first territorial governor. And Governor Campbell is thinking about all of the possibility of this vast state, this place where the plains meet the mountains, and you have a rugged people who are here who have a pioneering spirit. And as he talks about why should Wyoming become a state? Why do we deserve a place in the pantheon of other states? He says one of the things that Wyoming is going to put on a pedestal, one of the things that we're going to stand up is our belief in education. We in Wyoming believe that education is a path to a future. And so from the very beginning, from John Campbell forward through those territorial governors, from John Hoyt, who Hoyt Hall here is named after, on to Governor Moonlight, and then into our governors of statehood, many Wyoming governors have spoken about the importance of education, the importance of a well-educated population, and how that well-educated population can really capitalize on the future of Wyoming. So the hope and the dream is that we take those parcels of land that were designated and we can capitalize on that revenue so that those kids have excellent educational opportunities. And so the hope then is that we can maximize that revenue for the education of school children in Wyoming. And today, the funds, the revenue that comes from those lands, whether it's from the sale of lands or the leases or the bonuses or the investment that's made on those lands, amounts to about 20% of the revenue that comes into the School Foundation Program account. And so the School Foundation Program account is the account that the state uses to pay for education of school children in Wyoming. Now that really is a two-sided coin. About half of the monies come from local resources. So local districts are generating revenue. They are generating resource at the same time. As the state is generating revenue and generating resource, all with the idea that we are going to be able to fund education on a cost basis. So what does that excellent education in Wyoming cost? What does that cost look like? And then the state has a guarantee, a foundation program guarantee that we will pay that cost basis of the education of a school child in Wyoming. Now, it would be great if we had the economies of scale that some other places don't. But we like to have our space in Wyoming, and we like to be spread out. And sometimes we don't reach that economy of scale. But we really dream of the kid in Sundance having the same educational opportunities as the kid in Laramie. That the kid in Du Bois is going to have the same opportunities as a kid in Cheyenne. And so as we look across our state, what does it take for kids to have that excellent education? And so we fund that education from things like property taxes. And the legislature had tremendous discussion over property tax and what is appropriate taxation in that manner in the last session, the last couple of sessions, and continue to have that discussion. And we come up with revenues from things like federal mineral royalties. Our state is blessed with resources, and so we generate revenue from those resources. And all of those different resources help to fund that education. And that's why it becomes so critical, so important, that some piece of that comes from these lands that were designated for the purpose of generating revenue. So if we can get that 20% of the school foundation program revenues to help pay for that education, then that lessens the necessity for things like property tax. That then lessens the necessity for us to generate revenue through other means. Our courts have said that we have that obligation to pay for education. And so thinking of ways of how do we fund that education is really kind of part of the discussion of that balance Treasurer Meier was talking about. How do we balance what General Hill called two noble goods? How do we think about, when we have competing priorities, that necessity of generating revenue so that the school children of the state of Wyoming have that opportunity for great education? Just as a real quick experiment, how many of you went to school as a K through 12 somewhere, went to school in Wyoming? I did. For me, it was Southridge Elementary, CY Junior High, Natrona County High School, all in Casper. That's where my family has been since shortly after statehood. And I got an excellent education. So I literally am a beneficiary of what our state has invested in education. I see across the room, so many of you have been beneficiaries of that as well. And I think that's where that same pride and that same value that John Campbell talked about a belief in education, a belief that every kid in Wyoming is entitled that excellent educational opportunity, is the reason that we have that discussion. How do we generate those revenues so that those kids have that opportunity to build the future of Wyoming, to build our state? And it's not just for that picture of the future, it's for the today. And so I think about my folks as my folks have retired and decided that Wyoming's not just where they started their life, but where they're going to end their lives. That this state ought to be a great state for that young kid going to school, and it ought to provide for those of us that choose to make a life and to work here and to live here. And it ought to be able to provide for those folks like my parents who have decided that this is where they're going to spend their last days, that we have the people in Wyoming with the skills and the knowledge and the ability to move our state forward. And so ultimately, when we talk about doing something for the benefit of those beneficiaries, it's not abstract. It's not something that's out there. It's you. It's me. It's my kids. It's my grandkids now who have that opportunity for that excellent education in Wyoming. And so I think with that, we would really like to take questions from you. If you want the brilliant answers, General Hill will provide those. If you want the insight for investing, that's Treasurer Meier, and I'll answer any of the rest.
Thank you. Can you hear me? This question would be for Bridget, but it dovetails into much of the discussion that you've talked about as the purpose of school trust lands. drive revenue. I think Brian articulated that pretty well. But we had a recent Supreme Court ruling last year that dealt with state lands. And specifically, and Jason Crowder did a good job going over the act of admission on Section 5 that talks about the leasing of state lands as part of the accepting those, particularly under Article, I believe it's 7, Section 2, talks about the leasing of those school sections. Also, Article 18 in our Constitution talks about leasing. The question is deriving revenue off of these state lands, does that meet the definition of a governmental purpose? Because I think this is what Mr. Farmer was just talking about. Is that a governmental purpose to derive revenue off of these lands or not? Or is that just a fiduciary responsibility? That's very important in light of getting back to revenue. We're talking about $1.5 million a year. The legislature is going to have to cough up to pay property tax on these state school leases now, if that's not, in fact, a benefit, and not only a benefit, but a governmental purpose to derive revenue off of these school state lands. So, Bridget, in your new capacity, would you like to opine and give us a legal opinion on that?
I 100% would not like to opine about my legal opinion about that. What I will say is this, what the court found in that case, and as you know, we were a party to that case and tried to make that very argument that the Board of Land Commissioners has an independent duty put forth by our Wyoming Constitution. So of course, the raising of revenue off of those state trust lands had to be a governmental purpose. The court disagreed with us. They looked at we were asking them to distinguish some case law about how they determine governmental purposes. And as you know, they usually do that analysis by figuring out what the end use is. And they said, since you're leasing to people for a commercial use, we're going to go ahead and follow that case law and say that it's not a governmental purpose. But the legislature, the interesting part of that I would make the point to you, I think within that case, you have them allowing for the possibility that the legislature could nevertheless exempt state lands from taxation. Because when you look at the tax code, and they did in that case, there were specific exemptions from tax. And so the legislature can still, as you often have that opportunity with cases where they've interpreted the law as you have written it, go back and rewrite the law. So there's still an opportunity for the legislature to say, state trust land, sorry, that's exempt from taxation regardless of the end use. And so that ball is still very much in the legislature's hands. And that's how I'd like to comment on that. Obviously, like I said, we were a party to that case and we argued differently than they decided.
Yes, thank you. I do have a question, and I thought it would be for Pepper Ottman, House District 34. I thought it would be for Mr. Farmer, but now I'm not quite so sure. What my question is when we look at the amount of money that goes to education and that fiduciary responsibility, how do we determine that? Do we set into the 23 counties, okay, what do you want education to look like as far as expenditures, and then we have to raise that much money through state lands and federal programs and taxation? Or do we say this is the amount of money we have and we'll distribute it for education according to the population of students? So how does that work, and is it in harmony with each other, or is it against each other?
So the Wyoming Supreme Court has really kind of laid out its expectation around funding of schools. And the first thing that they've said is that that the educational system we want is the prerogative of the legislature. So the legislature gets to decide what they call a basket of goods. What are the things that you think kids ought to know or need to know? And they've created some parameters around that about what that must look like. But that's up to the legislature to decide. So are we going to teach math and language arts and foreign languages and career technical education, those kinds of things, what we call a basket of goods. And then once that's defined, it must be determined what does it cost to provide that. And so that cost basis has been the key of the last several court cases pertaining to that. And the legislature has relied upon experts to help determine the cost basis of the educational program. And once that expert has determined that cost basis, then the allocation has to be provided in a way that's uniform and equitable across the state, so that the kid in different parts of the state has the same opportunity to access those educational opportunities regardless of where they live. Now, all of that does balance with sort of a notion of what do local communities expect from their schools. And currently in Wyoming, we do have a block grant system that allocates an amount of money to a local community. And so if we say in parts of our state, we want to put more into career and technical education, then we can certainly do that. We can use those block grant funds, so long as we're providing that comprehensive uniform educational program. We can put more funding into the priorities of our local areas. And so when you hear about a board of trustees of a school district, they too sort of have a trustee responsibility to those students in providing that educational experience or opportunity for the kids. So the state has the responsibility of generating the revenue, and the state land board has that responsibility of managing those state lands. And then once it's allocated to the local district has the responsibility of allocating the funds to provide for that quality education for kids. And of course, the legislature plays its part. As a matter of fact, every single person in this room, regardless of their background, what they bring to it is a part of that picture. Our industries are a part of that picture. Our parents and the different voices of what we want for our kids are a part of that picture. And so there is that balance of the various stakeholders and what stakeholders want and expect, and then how we can provide it. But as to the question you ask about how do we determine that cost and what do we pay for it, that starts with the legislature determining the basket and then costing that out through the experts that determine what is the cost of providing that education and then allocating those funds.